Well, hello YouTube, and welcome back to the Whole Schmid channel and another big boring job, or another big boring job. Today we're going to take a planer head like this one and bore it out. The original bore is 35 millimeters, and we need this as a sharpening jig for a set of carbide knives. And so the plan is to drill it out because we don't have an arbor in 35 millimeters. So the easiest way is just go ahead and drill this out to 40 millimeter, which is the arbor size of the sharpening machine. So we're just going to go ahead and go that route. Otherwise, we'll just go ahead and make an arbor for it. Could do that too. Anyway, we decided to go the route of least resistance and just bore out this old head. Now, this isn't the head that we're going to be boring out. The job's already done, so I just brought this in here as a prop to kind of show you guys, you know, for the intro of what's going on. So the first step we're going to have to do is bolt this pig to the table. And the one thing that I didn't record is to verify the squareness of the sides to the long axis here. And so what I did is I just took a square, held it in against the bore, and set it down, you know, the short leg of the thing, and then measured it that way to just kind of check it to make sure. And then once it was bolted to the table, then I took the square and ran it up against the side to see how square it was, because we had to put it on parallels to allow for chip clearance. Otherwise the chips would have just built up inside the bore and been a problem after about the third pass, where the bore would have just filled up, and then you'd have to either blow them out from the top or dismount the whole thing and everything. So anyway, so here's how we're going to mount it to the table. So now we're going to find center with the old centricator. Unfortunately, what I did is a little bit of a Mr. Bozo, where the stop rod ran up onto the hold down bolt, and it popped it out. And I think I might have bent something in the centricator there, and it kind of starts to, it's doing the Chinese thing where it's kind of bebopping a little bit. So I don't know, I might have to send it in for repair. So a little bozo mistake there, just on the heads up. So here's how we're going to center the bore.
Fucking swift. God damn, that is fucking dumb. Almost around you.
So now that the bore is centered, I'm going to put in the boring bar. Now this boring bar I have was originally intended for a horizontal bore, or to be mounted horizontally in the boring head for that big metering gate that we saw in the first big boring job that this bar did. But it was long enough to where it would almost reach all the way through, and so I just decided to go ahead and take it and use it instead of making a new one. It was just a little easier that way. But the one thing that I forgot to mention early on is these heads are hardened and then they're tempered. And so I took a file to it to see whether or not I could actually scratch it. The file went through pretty good, and I noticed one thing as I was drilling it out, that the bore wasn't perfectly cylindrical. That means there were varying degrees of hardness in the cut, and so the knife would deflect and create little lumps and bumps and so forth in the bore. So, but anyway, here's how we're going to start boring that out. Now, if you've ever picked up one of these heads, you'll notice that the bore doesn't go down very far and then it flares out. And the reason being for that is that when you stick it on a shaft, sometimes the bores don't line up perfectly. You can get a shaft aligned perfectly, or straight, but to get a bore perfectly straight like this on that kind of a tight fit, because there's only a few hundredths of a millimeter. I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of play, that you got to have a slip fit, but yet it can't have any slop. So to get these things perfectly cylindrical is pert near impossible. The other thing that has to happen is you have to have a little air to go past the shaft. Otherwise the thing will just suck down so tight you can't get it off the shaft anymore. And so they put a little bit of a bore in there. And then the third reason is if there's any grit or dirt, minute wood particles, whatever, on the shaft, again, you won't be able to pull these heads off. So we're going to utilize a unique feature of the boring head that I have in order to establish that flared bore, about 20 millimeters from each end of the bore. And here's how we're going to do that. So we're going to utilize the unique feature of the boring head where you can actually plane with it in order to establish a larger bore inside the bore. And so what we're going to do is we're going to switch it on, like right here. So now once it's switched on, now we can just turn on the knife, or we'll lower our knife to where we want it, run it out like right here till it touches. So now that we've got the bore now, established, or the dimension established that we want, now we can just run it through and get it bored out to the size we want. So well, YouTubers, that's a wrap for this big boring job, or big boring job. Hope you guys got a little something out of it. Again, it shows some of the unique features of boring heads, or some boring heads, like your Wohlhaupter. This one that I have is by Schmid. Functions in a similar way, where you can actually engage a feed and do concentric milling with it that you can't do with like one of these cheaper little $100 jobbies from China or whatever. If you can do that with these, but with the cheap ones too, the only thing is you can only go incrementally. You have to turn by hand or turn on the machine, let it rotate once or twice, then give it another couple of hundredths, and then keep advancing it that way until you've established the depth of cut that you want. It's kind of a pain in the ass, but with this kind of setup, it makes that task a whole lot less tedious and makes it real easy to follow through. Now, the one thing I will add to this, there was no, other than the initial bore having to be 40 millimeters, the larger bore, it was Moxnix, it could be whatever it wanted to be. So we weren't really bound by a dimension as such, and that way you can just kind of, run out on it and do whatever you want. So that's the reason that we're going with that. Now, if we had to do a certain size bore, it would be better to do it on the lathe, but unfortunately the way these heads are set up, I'd have to mount up the 4-jaw chuck and get it centered and all that good jazz, and then you could do that. But because the chuck on the lathe here doesn't really want to come off, the backing plate and so forth, it was just impossible to get it to center right in a 3-jaw, so I just opted to go ahead and do it on the mill. The other thing is, like I mentioned before, when you do this kind of boring job, it's virtually impossible to get the bore cylindrical. You mean through and through. You can do it on, if you don't have a lathe, then you have to do it on the mill. To get those two bores, because this head is a little longer than the bar itself, I had to flip it over once and then come in from the other side. And so when you do that, those bores will rarely, if ever, line up perfectly to where they meet, and you won't have a good solid fit. So when you go to slipping this thing on a shaft or on an arbor, it's going to hang up on you. And then if you try and force it on, then of course, you know, it's game over. You're not going to get it on or off anymore. It's going to be stuck. And so that's the reason you put in that bigger bore, so that in case there is a little bit of a difference, just a few hundredths or a few thousandths, then you can still work with the bore the way it is. And so that's the reason I went and opted for that. So the head went on the board just fine. Unfortunately, I don't have any video footage of that. And the guy doing the sharpening, he was just tickled plum pink with it, and he's happier than a bug in a rug. So anyway, that's a wrap for this episode of Big Boring Job. Hope you guys got a little something out of it. And if you have any thoughts, comments, critiques, suggestions, or would like to share some of your own experiences to add to the monologue here, by all means put it in the comment section below. We recently went over 1,000 subscribers on the channel, and I welcome all those new subscribers that have came on board and that are interested in this subject matter, and I hope you guys enjoy future videos. And so with that, we'll see you guys all again soon.